I'm delighted to welcome all of you in this workshop, its purpose of which is to share with you our progress and findings at midpoint of our current research and study on women's empowerment and control over their time in Sub-Saharan Africa through a macro, meso, and micro level study, and to receive the valuable commentary from the discussions and others in the discussion that will ensue. First, I want to take the opportunity to thank the Hewlett Foundation and its officers, and especially Althea Anderson of the Gender Equality and Governance Program, for the inspired and thoughtful leadership, the far-reaching interest in exploring the issues of women's empowerment, and the generous financial support to the Levy Institute's Gender Inequality program, under which this workshop and the findings of this research are being undertaken. The Hewlett Foundation has been a benefactor to the Levy Institute, having supported our research in Sub-Saharan Africa, has supported policy roundtables in the region, and gender and macroeconomics workshops that started in 2014. This work relies on the expertise and research abilities not only of my institute colleagues and scholars, Ajit Zacharias, Thomas Masterson, Fernando Rios Avila, and Luisa Nassif Pires, but also of our country partners. And I want to mention the Salashu Desta in Ethiopia, Abena Oduro in Ghana, Latif Dramani in Mali, and Flora Mayampa in Tanzania. For over 20 years or so, research focusing on women's control of their time and the implications of the maldistribution of unpaid work has received increased attention because of the recognition of its importance in measuring a society's well-being. In developing countries, such as the countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, much of the provisioning of basic needs and other conveniences of living occur in the household and beyond the boundaries of market transactions. Women's decision-making power is dependent on both macroeconomic and microeconomic factors. Collecting, analyzing, synthesizing data on how members of household bargain and allocate time for unpaid work production would allow us to determine women's control of their time. As my colleagues would indicate, there are some novel measurements we want to develop and analyze, such as women's decision-making autonomy, investigate and assess the strength of patriarchy, marriage patterns, and living arrangements in the countries on the meso level, the region level, and determine their respective effects on the division of time. Our study research findings would show that the unequal distribution of time, or at least we hope it will show, that the unequal distribution of time in performing home production, including care work between women and men, has consequences at all levels of the economy and on household well-being. I don't wish to preempt the progress reports that will be presented by my colleagues and our partners, but it is sufficient for me to say that I'm sure at the conclusion of this project, suggestions for necessary reforms would be made as to regard to promote women's decision-making autonomy of their time and to change the burden of the unequally distributed unpaid work and implement changes in the labor market functioning. Once more, I want to thank you very much for your participation in this workshop. It is our hope that the pandemic would subside and that perhaps will enable us to hold our next events in person. So again, thank you very much. Welcome and enjoy the workshop. Thank you. I think, Ajit, you're next.
Oh, no,
Thank you.
Luisa.
Sorry.
Yeah, I'll just say a couple words about the logistics for the day, and then we'll begin with the presentations. So I put a message in the chat box to let you know that closed captioning is available for this and tomorrow's session. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you should see a CC button, which will allow you to see the captions at the bottom. You can then save a transcript of those captions at the end of the meeting for your records and aid with translation if necessary. I want to thank Dimitri for his opening remarks and welcome everybody to the session. And so we're going to have 4 presentations from Luisa Nassif-Pires, Ajit Zacharias, Fernando Rios-Avila, and myself. And then our 2 discussants for today are Beatrice Mkenda and Nkechi Oo, and they're both here. Thank you for agreeing to discuss our work. And I'll be keeping an eye on the attendees and members of the research team, including our country partners, Abina Oduro, Chalachu Desta, Flora Miamba, and Latif Dramani are on the call as well. And I've allowed them to talk, but I asked them to reserve comments until after the discussants are done, until we get to the Q&A section. And for the rest of you, if you have questions, please put them in the chat, and I'll keep track of that for the Q&A session. And with that, I will turn it over to Louise.
Good morning. Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the globe. Thank you so much, Tom. Thank you, Dimitri. And I'm going to share my screen. Oh, I need permission to share the screen, please, Tom.
Oh, okay. You should have permission.
Host disabled participant screen sharing.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Okay. All right. I'm making you a co-host so you can share.
Okay.
You should
I can share now.
Okay. Good. Apologies.
Can everyone see my screen? It's on my first slide. Yes, right? Okay. Thank you so much. So I'll keep it on the 20 minutes so you can have a good discussion. I'll be discussing today the determinants of women's decision-making power in Sub-Saharan Africa, as we're all going to be discussing, but I'll be talking mostly of a survey of previous research and setting the ground, the theoretical ground for the discussion that we're going to have. So I'll start with an introduction. So the objective of the project, the overall project, is to provide policy recommendations that can effectively decrease time poverty among women in Sub-Saharan Africa. So this is our end goal with the project overall. But with this paper specifically, I'll be trying to establish the relationship between women's decision-making power and household production and time allocation on the theoretical ground, and then present the theoretical literature on women's empowerment and bargaining power. So understanding what determines women's empowerment and bargaining power from a theoretical perspective, so then we can understand how that could possibly affect time allocation. And then I'll review the empirical literature on women's empowerment in Sub-Saharan Africa. I want to already let you all know that there is really not much empirical work done on specifically the question of how women's decision-making power affects time allocation. There is a theoretical discussion on that, but there is no empirical work, basically because there is no real data that combines something that can directly measure women's empowerment. So basically any research that has tried to establish the relationship between bargaining power and time allocation has done so through proxies of what would be understood as bargaining power, of what can affect bargaining power, but not directly measuring something like women's autonomy or agency that can be done with decision-making indices or decision-making questionnaires that exist, but that usually are not part of a time use survey. So we're focusing on 5 countries for this project: Mali, Ghana, Ethiopia, Tanzania, and South Africa. And out of 189 countries, the gender inequality index of those countries are really low in the gender inequality, or very far in the end of the gender inequality index. So South Africa is in 93rd position, Ethiopia in 125th, Ghana 135th, Tanzania 140th, and Mali in 158th. This is 2021 gender inequality index. And the time use in those countries are very unequally shared. This is from Sham 2019. He does a combination of all time use surveys, the latest time use surveys that we have for each of those countries when the paper was out. We'll be using a different time use surveys ourselves because we're waiting on Mali's. Anyways, I'll let others get to that point when we're discussing that specifically. But I just wanted to give an overview of how unequal time is divided between men and women for household production in those countries. And I really want to call attention to the case of Mali, which on Sharm's paper is the second worst in the world in terms of the female to male ratio. So women in Mali are doing 11.5 times more, spending 11.5 more time in household production than men. The only country in his study that is above that is El Salvador in Central America. So I'll now start with the theoretical perspectives. So when discussing household work allocation, there are 3 general theories that are used to explain the unequal division, or they're used to explain how the time is allocated between men and women. The first one is time availability theory, which departs a little from the unitary model that understands that men and women are going to be optimizing their time, and they're going to be focusing on what they have an advantage on. And as a consequence, the idea would be that the partner, so for couples, the partner that has more time available is going to spend more time on household production. So it kind of just this theory doesn't really allow us to discuss what is it that makes time unequally divided. It kind of just assumes it off in a way. And we will be focusing actually on the second and the third, which is the resource theory and the gender ideology theory. So resource theory already starts taking into account the power relationship between partners, and would say that the partner that has more resources, that has access to more resources, would have more bargaining power, and so would be able to set the discussion within the household on how time would be allocated, or have more agency on deciding on how time would be allocated than the one that has less. This already comes in the back of that. We would have the type of cooperative games or non-cooperative game coming from game theory and understanding that there is a fallback solution. So if the marriage doesn't work, each partner have a possibility of being in a fallback position, and this would set the ground for the discussion within the marriage. And someone that has less to count on or depends more on a partner would have less bargaining power in the marriage. The gender ideology theory takes into account a kind of more institutional or outside the marriage background to understand how the household allocation might happen. So to discuss a little bit the bargaining power, because I think this is going to be important for us to understand why is it that we're looking into decision making, why is it that we're looking into bargaining power. I'm looking to our Garwal 1997 paper, and she establishes what are the determinants of bargaining power already so her paper is already expanding what others had talked about before, discussing what are those resources that are important for bargaining power and taking into account already some more macro and meso level aspects of it. So for her, ownership and control over assets, and in a rural setting, especially arable land, which I think it's important for our discussion here, is very important. Access to income, and that might be through employment or other means. Access to communal resources, village commons, forests, so any kind of common lands and common spaces. Access to support, to traditional social support systems, such as patronage, kinship, case grouping. So being part of a group, having a support group around you is important. And in that sense, support from NGOs as well, support from the state. And then she brings in some aspects that are already expanding the idea of bargaining power, and talks about the perception of needs and deservedness, that being important in bargaining power. So what is it that someone thinks they can bargain about depends as well on how they perceive what they deserve and how they perceive that they need. And the social norms, of course. And empowerment is very related to bargaining power. Those two things are not exactly the same, but empowerment, I'll be using here Kabir's 2005, and actually Kabir's work has been consistent, her definition of empowerment over time. And she says that empowerment refers to the process by which those who have been denied the ability to make choices acquire such an ability. And she looks into 3 dimensions of empowerment. So there is agency, which has to do with your capacity or your power to actually make a decision, or the potential to make a decision, your resources, and the achievements. So the achievements is how you would measure if the potential has been realized or not. With that background, I want us to try to understand theoretically how we go from the idea of what is empowerment and what is bargaining power, and how that would affect the use of time. So as I've been saying, empowerment or the power that a person has in terms of making decisions depends on individual factors. So access to assets, employment, income, perceptions, and so on. Household factors, so the type of marriage, so the type of relationship that the partners have, the household wealth and composition, if there are other people in the household, and age difference has been seen to be also very important. So age not only as an individual factor, but also the age difference between partners, the social norms and institutions. So all that affect bargaining power, and that's well established in the literature. And we do have studies that have measured those aspects, how they impact the decision-making power of women. And then we also have on the theoretical end how bargaining power itself impacts the use of time that comes from resource theory, and also in this very end here, and thinking of gender ideology also impacting bargaining power. We also have that type of research that has been done. But usually that research, when it comes to empirical work, what has been done is directly trying to see the impact of those individual factors and household factors in the use of time, but not trying to look into how those factors impact women's decision-making power, or how women's decision-making power that could be measured by those factors impact the use of time. So basically the idea here is that women's decision-making power is tightly related to bargaining power, and that it should have as well an impact on the use of time. So thinking that when women have agency to decide, when women have the capacity and the potential to decide, will they use more time? Will they spend more time doing household production? Will they spend less time? Will they share it more equally? Is there a relationship between women's decision-making power and the allocation between partners? This is the question we have in the back of our minds. So let me see how I'm doing with time. Okay. So there are some measures of women's empowerment that has been used. So one of them, and I think we'll be focusing mostly on that, is the participation of women in household decision making. And this is one of the ways we'll be measuring this, because we want to look into individual measures of women's empowerment. We're not really looking into more general ones, although Ajit's going to get to the part of patriarchy and regional aspects, and then we'll discuss a little bit of that as well. But also women, so some people have used access and control over resources as a measure of empowerment, women's mobility, and women's attitude toward men's intimate partner violence, and attitudes toward gender roles. The first one and the last one usually are measured through questionnaires, so survey questionnaires. We will specifically be looking into the DHS, the Demographic Health Survey of each of those countries. And there are, since 1999, there are questions on who makes decisions in the DHS. And here I'm only putting the questions that have continued over time, so that we have for all the countries that we're studying over time. There was also a question on who usually decides on daily household purchases. That question was dropped out of the survey. So for the countries we're looking here, we only had that question for Ghana 2008, so I've omitted that. So we're basically looking into 5 questions. The first one is who mainly makes decisions on wife's healthcare, who makes decisions on major household purchases, who makes decisions on visits to her family or relatives, who makes decisions on the money that husband earns, that's only asked to the partner of men that earn money, and who makes decisions on the money that the wife earns. So these are questions that are asked to all women in the questionnaire that are between 19 and 45 years old, and that are married. So it's one of the blocks of the DHS, and we can see that. And then there are three options. Well, there are a few options. There is, if they make the decision alone, if they make the decision jointly with their partners, if the husband makes the decision alone, or if someone else is making the decision for them. And basically what we can see is that the patterns between those countries are very, very different between questions. It's very hard to see a clear pattern here, but we do see that some countries, and those are related to the time use. I mean, here just really looking into some isolated facts, and no causality can be really claimed at this point. But we see, for example, that in the case of Mali, where time is very, very unequally allocated, we also perceive that women are less likely or less usually participating on decisions or participating jointly on decisions. So there are some questions on how we can use this DHS data. I mean, the first one is, which is not even here, but this is, and this is the part that we have a solution for. The DHS does not have data on time use, but we will be, we are already joining those two surveys together. So we are doing a statistical matching to impute a value for the answer to those questions into the time use, so we can relate those things. But then we have a question of how we're gonna actually treat this data. The first one, should we build an index with all those questions, or should we look into them separately? And Fernando later today is going to be talking a little bit more about the difficulties with the index, so I won't touch on that much. And this is related actually to the fact that these decisions are not necessarily that correlated, and they are multidimensional. So they are measuring actually different dimensions of decision making. So for example, who decides on visits has to do with women's mobility. Who decides on purchases has to do to access to resources and financial decisions. So they don't necessarily measure the same thing. So we cannot necessarily collapse them into one index, because it would be as if we're just not really considering certain dimensions of it. The other question here is if we should differentiate making decisions alone from making decisions jointly. Are we supposed to be looking into women participating in decisions or not? Or do we think that women deciding alone means more than deciding jointly? How to interpret the difference between those two options? And the other and final question on this, which we have been talking a lot about, is if participating on a decision necessarily implies agency, or sometimes it could imply a burden. And I think this was especially the case with the question on daily purchases, because, for example, we could have that women have a specific amount of money that they are allowed to spend every day to buy groceries. So they don't really have a power of deciding how much is going to be spent. They're just really having the burden of having to do shopping every day or something like that. So decision also comes with a cost of time specifically. So this is very important for our question here, because having more decisions to make also might impact the fact that you are having more time to spend on making those decisions. So I'm going to give a very short overlook on the previous literature on decision-making power. And this literature is really mostly on health issues, especially because we're talking about the DHS survey here. So it is a health survey, and it has a lot of questions on children, on children's health. It has questions on fertility. It has questions on violence partner, as I have mentioned before. So these are the things that have been explored in terms of the DHS. So people have not, I mean, of course, there might be something there, but from the research we've done so far, we have extensively looked into the previous literature on this. We haven't found anyone that has used the DHS data to discuss something that is not within that survey, or empirical work that has used those surveys to imply something else. There are some multi-country studies. There are studies on other countries, of course, because the DHS is not focused only on those countries, but here focusing on the countries of our interest. So there are a few work in Ghana. It's one of the countries where we found more research using the DHS. One of them finds that age increases women's autonomy in decision-making, while not earning an income reduces their autonomy. They also find that religion is not significant. So we're using all of this to try to understand what determines women's decision-making power. Another one finds that wealthier women are more likely to participate in decisions. So income and wealth seem overall from the studies we've looked to have an impact on decision, while age, employment, and tertiary education also have some impact. So also we find consistently in Ghana that the age difference, or being younger, or the age at marriage as well. Some people have talked about impacts decision-making power of women. On Ethiopia, there is, that the first paper here that I'm mentioning uses a index to build a decision-making index, and finds that women's autonomy in decision-making increase the odds of them seeking healthcare. And another one find that women that makes decisions jointly with their husbands had lower risk of domestic violence when compared to women that do not do it jointly. So this is an interesting study for us to think about how to use how to code those questions, because sometimes making decisions jointly do matter and has a different impact on outcomes than making decisions alone. There is some work in Ghana that has found that that is specifically looked into the difference between deciding alone or deciding jointly, and shown that those have different impacts. In Mali, one of the studies we looked at explored ideal family size and doesn't really find any significant impact on women participating in the decision on the number of children, but find that they also find that attitudes towards domestic violence. So women that are against domestic violence or think that it's not acceptable are more likely to have more children. And this made Mali specific. This is a multi-country study, and Mali was the only country where that weird result was found, that special result. It almost points to the idea that having more children empowers women in some way. And the other one that we looked at finds that participating decisions reduces women's probability of finding wife beating justifiable. So this goes in line with the Ethiopian study. So some studies have shown that autonomy in decision-making does decrease partner violence. In Tanzania, the only study that we found using the DHS they do a very extensive literature review of those matters, but they don't apply any model. They look more into summary statistics, and they claim that women's participation in decisions increases with age, number of children, and educational level. That women that are employed for cash have a higher likelihood of participating on decisions than other women, and that rural women are less likely to have a final say in the decisions. And then the case of South Africa is very special because the first DHS that has data on the first DHS in South Africa, which actually asks the questions of decision making, was only released in 2019, which means that all of the multi-country studies we've looked at have taken out South Africa because they didn't have data for that yet. And basically, there might be some papers out there. If anyone here knows of them, I would be very happy. I've been looking a lot, and I haven't found anyone that explored decision-making power of women in South Africa using the DHS yet. I am sure those are going to start coming out. But if the data was released in 2019, it means that those papers are still on the process of being published or being written, which also gives us a gap there that we are feeling in terms of South Africa. But using other research, so some people use qualitative data or other surveys that have decision-making questions. One of them has found that being a head holder, so being the head of a household, makes it more likely for women to make final decisions, even when they earn less. So being the head of a household is a marker of being a decision maker in a way. And when I looked into the DHS, there is a high correlation between headship and decision-making power. And we can explore this a little more. And finally, another paper using their own questionnaire for just the Mahican municipality finds that education, occupation, religion, duration of union, home language, and the perception on husbands' right to sex, they all affect the decision on use of contraceptives. So it's a very specific questionnaire that they use. We also have questions on the use of contraceptive on DHS, but we're not using those on our research because it would reduce the sample. It is only for very specific women that question is asked, and we've tried to code it in a certain way that we would still have a big part of the sample, but we would lose too much of the sample of that. So just to conclude, in the theoretical perspective, we can say that women's empowerment impacts resource allocation within households. That has been well established. So we're doing a very small leap here and saying that it also impacts the allocation of time, because in terms of what impacts bargaining power and how we've looked into previous, there are previous empirical research looking into what impacts bargaining power directly impacting the allocation of time. Consequently, empowering women could impact time poverty. So this is where we hope that our research can help policymakers create policies that could empower women and therefore decrease time poverty. There is no previous research on how women's empowerment would impact the intra-household allocation of time dedicated to household production. And some of the data difficulties that we are facing here can be overcome by matching the DHS data to the time use data. Some other are still a difficulty for us, and we'll be talking about them today and what are the ways we've been overcoming those. So basically, our project really attempts to fill a gap that has been seen in the literature, and hopefully can inform policymakers in a way that we do progress. Thank you so much. I don't know if I went too much over time, but I hope not. Let me stop my share. Oh, actually, sorry. Are we having questions now, or?
No, we'll have questions after.
Okay. I had a last slide which just had the references, but I'll share the slides with everyone just because I've cited so many things. I've put all the references there.
Thank you, Luisa. Next, we'll have Ajit go.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for the first day of the workshop. Because we are holding it virtually, we decided to split the event over 2 days. If we were to hold it in Accra or in Johannesburg, we would have had it in a single day. But because of the Zoom fatigue, which I'm sure that all of you are familiar with, we plan to spread it over 2 days. So let me just start sharing my screen with you. We can get going here. Okay, so I assume that everybody can see the screen. Okay, so as Luisa said in her overview of the literature and general theoretical approaches to empowerment and decision making, a crucial factor that's been discussed extensively in feminist theory, as well as in the sociological and ethnographic literature, is the power of patriarchy. And we are taking a view that will require us to step outside of our comfort zones in economics and delve a little bit into history and anthropological approaches to looking at the issue of patriarchy, because the measurement of patriarchy as a set of institutions has actually been more work has been done by those scholars, as I will share with you in the coming slides that I have. So this is all joint work that I've been doing together with the team members, as well as our team members at Levy, as well as the country partners. The work is at a very preliminary stage, so I do really welcome comments and suggestions that you might have about what I'm going to present. So just as an introductory observation, the literature on patriarchy shows that it operates at several levels, which are kind of interdependent with each other. So we can think about it as shaping outcomes, for example, gender differences in pay or educational attainment. There are structures, patriarchal structures, which can be exemplified by living arrangements of adult men and women, as well as occupational segregation, if you were to look at the employment side of the story. Ideological factors are also very important. For example, values regarding health choices made for men, or for boys and girls, or whether to send the boy or the girl to the school, and so on. Then there are also factors related to agency, which again is something that Louisa touched upon in her presentation. And women's collective action is important in this, and how they may have representation. Political representation is a very important issue, as well as agency as reflected in individual informal interactions. For example, violence against women, difficulty of women to going to public places, and so on, right? So in this work that I'm going to share with you today, we are focused mainly on structures and ideology, although patriarchy is a much broader subject and operates at several levels. We are also looking at subnational or meso-level variations on structures and ideology. Basically, we're looking at factors that shape power relations within the household, and the ideological considerations that come into play and shape those power relations. We are motivated by the recent research on history of family, as well as on feminist economic research on gender attitudes and patriarchal norms. And there is also a broad literature on subnational disparities in Sub-Saharan Africa, looking at gender disparities within these countries, individual countries. Okay, so for the presentation today, I'm going to focus on the way we approach this issue of patriarchal structures, the measurement of patriarchal structures, by presenting to you subnational indices of patriarchal structures. And I will also be presenting estimates of subnational indices of patriarchal ideology. Then we will take a preliminary look at the relationship between structures and ideologies. And as the countries that we're going to look at are the countries that was mentioned by Louisa in her presentation, namely Ethiopia, Ghana, Mali, South Africa, and Tanzania. Okay, so starting with patriarchal structures, the basic concept that we are using here of patriarchy is the one that is based largely on the work on Goran Thurbon. And the idea is actually quite simple. It's the rule of the father, primarily over the sons and daughters, primarily over the daughters, and the rule of the husband. So the parental rule, it basically reflects in the inheritance patterns, the power of the offspring, men, boys and girls, to choose their marital partners, and the ability to move away from the parental household or the paternal household. And the rule of the husband is often captured by household headship, which is an important factor in studies of empowerment, as Louisa pointed out again, and the characteristic of spouses, such as age and so on. And another dimension of patriarchy is physical sacrifice or suffering imposed selectively on girls and women. The theoretical focus has mainly been on social norms. So to talk in a Weberian language, they focus on the ideal types. But in practice, what we can observe are the outcomes of social practices, right? So we can look at patterns of marriage and household structure, and from there infer the prevalence or the strength of the social norms or the ideal types, so to speak. So the construction of the indices themselves, they follow a model. I largely draw from a model that's been advanced by Gruber and Soltysek in a study of the history of family in Europe and of the historical trends. And as you can see here, the idea is to construct 4 indices, sub-indices, And each of those are in 4 domains, if you like, of patriarchal structures. And from underlying each sub-index is a set of indicators. So to take, for example, the first sub-index that's shown on the slide, the first to the left, the leftmost to your leftmost of your screen, is the male domination sub-index, or the domination of men over women. So we have several indicator variables that attempt to capture this. For example, female headship, right? Female proportion of female household heads. So we have an indicator then for that, and our expected association with patriarchy for that. So the higher that value of that indicator, lower will be the prevalence or the strength of patriarchy. So we have a number of indicators like that that go into the male domination sub-index. And similarly, we also have the generational domination, which is a very important factor when we consider family structures in Sub-Saharan Africa, or for that matter in South Asia. And then there is a patrilocal bias, and there is also son preference, which also is very important in the Sub-Saharan context, and even more so in the South Asian context. So to go into the little bit of detail regarding the sub-indices here, and starting with the male domination sub-index, basically here we are looking at indicators that are related to headship. For example, in a strongly patriarchal society, we would expect men to be generally meant to be the heads. Of course, the ideal type is only men can be household heads. So the indicator of pertaining to female headship is then something that's inversely related to that feature of patriarchy. We also have age, which is a very important factor in shaping male domination. And 2 ways that the age comes into play here is the age at which women marry, for example, the young wives, and the ability that males in the family, especially the husband and other elder male relatives in the family, will have over women. And there is also the age gap between the husband and the wife, which is important. Then we have another variable which is related to the mobility that Louisa again touched upon it, the ability of women, young women, to live apart from their paternal household, and that show itself as them living as non-kin. For example, young women who migrate from rural areas to urban areas to seek employment and live together with other young women in settings like that. So the ability of women to actually do that. So that's another variable that we have here. Then for the generational domination, we have several variables here. So I don't want you to focus too much on the indicators because they're pretty detailed and nuanced. But let me just lay out what we are trying to focus upon here. The first one is related to headship. How likely is it for an older man to live in a family household that's headed by a younger man? Because the oldest man is always the household head. That would be the ideal type in patriarchy. The other indicator that we are looking at is related to the ability of young men to establish households of their own. Again, in an ideal patriarchal society, sons will have limited ability to do so. So we focus on like men in the 20 to 29 age group and look at the incidence of headship among them. The other factor is related to the inability of men to form households independently of their parents or their father, and that would show up itself in the inability of several older men to form households of their own, right? And we can detect that by the presence of lateral relatives among men in the households. And finally, a classic indicator of patriarchy is the presence of stem and joint families. So that's again another indicator variable that we consider here going into the generational domination sub-index. Patrilocality, it's basically referring to married couple living with or near the husband's parents. We can't really measure proximity given the data that we have, and I'll come to the data in a minute. And we have already accounted for the presence of joint and STEM families in the generational sub-index. So what we look at here is something specific. We have about daughters and married daughter living with the fathers and mothers, right? So that we would expect to be negatively correlated with patrilocality. Finally, there's a son preference sub-index. So we have two indicators here. One is related to the proportion of boys among the last child in the 10 to 14 age group. That we would expect to be positively associated with patriarchy, because after the birth of the daughter, parents will try to have another child. That's the idea. So we would expect boys to be more among the last children than girls, right? And the second one is the standard one that's been used widely in literature, which looks at the sex ratio. So the more there are boys per 100 girls, the more is the prevalence of patriarchy. So in terms of the modeling itself, we have a index value P for each indicator that we talked about. Remember, we had the several indicator variables. So we measure them in such a way that, again, I don't want to get into the details of the formula here, but the basic idea is that each indicator is a number that's ranged between 0 and 10. And we form the subindex, each subindex, as simply the arithmetic sum of the index values of its indicators divided by the number of indicators in the subindex. So that, again, the subindices will be a number that ranges between 0 and 10. And the index of patriarchal structures that I'm going to present the results on now is basically just the sum of its subindices. So it will range between 0 and 40. The only exception to this general procedure here is related to the one that's related to son preference, right? So there we use threshold values rather than in the other secant formulas. You can say there is a max value. In the son preference one, you can see that there is a I star variable, which are reference values for the share of last born boys and the sex ratio. Okay, so briefly looking at the data, we are using the public use data files from the censuses of these countries. So the huge samples basically ranging like from 1.5 million in Mali to about 7.5 million in Ethiopia. And we are constructing the indices at the subnational level, so at the regional level. So the last column, I mean the column, the rightmost column on the slide, lists the number of regions for which we are doing these calculations in the individual countries. And as you can see, they range from like 9 in South Africa and Mali to 10 in Ghana, 11 in Ethiopia, and 30 in Tanzania. Okay, so just to get an overview here of the results, I'm showing here the box plot of the estimate for each country. So the distribution of the values of the index across the regions in each country. So we can see that the regional disparities are the highest in Ghana, if you look at the spread of the distribution, followed by Ethiopia. And it seems like South Africa and Tanzania are the ones that shows the lowest amount of interregional variation, while Mali occupying an intermediate position. It's also very striking how Mali, excluding the outliers, do not overlap at all with South Africa or Tanzania. So looking at the average values for the countries, you can see that Mali appears to be the highest, which is consistent with some of the evidence that Luis has already presented in terms of like decision-making power and division of household production responsibilities. Mali ranks the highest in terms of the strength of patriarchal structures. Ethiopia and Ghana shows roughly similar intermediate values, and then South Africa and Tanzania have the lower range of values. Taking a quick look at the estimates for the different countries. So what the results shown here is for Ethiopia, and each bar shows the composition of the patriarchal index, or the index of patriarchal structure, in terms of the contribution of the sub-indices to the overall strength of patriarchy. So we have male domination, generational domination, patriarchality, and sun preference. So those are the four segments of each of the bars shown here. And the regions are sorted from the lowest value of the index. For example, in this case, it's Addis Ababa, to the highest, and which here is the Somali region. So what we can see here is a general pattern is that sun preference is strongly associated with higher levels of patriarchy. And also within Ethiopia, it's interesting that sun preference do not at all appear. That is, it is a value of 0 if you look at Addis or Amhara or Tigray. The other striking fact is that the generational domination is an important component of the patriarchal structures, which would be very different than what you would see in a developed capitalist country like the United States, for example, generally speaking. Turning to, now I'm going to go a little bit quickly over the results for the other countries, because I know that I'm running short on time. Again, the split across regions for Ghana, we see the same salience of generational domination as an element of the strength of patriarchy in all the regions. And we can also see the influence of sun preference in pushing certain regions above the national average. Upper East and Upper West regions are particularly striking in terms of the prevalence of sun preference. To Mali quickly, here again, it's Bamako, not surprisingly, shows the lowest level in terms of the strength of patriarchy, with Kidal showing the highest. Once again, the importance of sun preference in pushing the value higher above the national average is clear, and so is the proper importance of generational dominance. Finally, South Africa, a surprising result here, at least surprising to me, was that Gauteng, which has Pretoria and Johannesburg in it, ranks pretty high among the regions of South Africa in terms of the strength of patriarchal structures. Once again, the male domination index weighs here less than generational domination in all regions except Gauteng, which again is related to its somewhat counterintuitive position in the hierarchy of patriarchal strength in South Africa. Tanzania, the picture is more complex and it's harder to read, but just to give you, because of so many regions there, but just to give you an overview of the result, as probably one would expect, Zanzibar South ranks the highest in terms of the strength of patriarchy, and Mtwara ranks the lowest, with Arusha and Dar es Salaam, not surprisingly, appearing to the bottom of this list. One interesting result which distinguishes the Tanzanian findings from the other countries is that sun preference is not really a big factor here. So 16 out of the 30 regions show a value of 0 for the sub-index. The other thing is that the generational domination is really, generally speaking, the largest component of the strength of patriarchal structures in Tanzania. Just to summarize the findings here quickly, male domination and generational domination are equally important in shaping the strength of patriarchal structure, and generational domination carries more weight than male domination in regions with lower strength of patriarchal structures. The only exception here is Tanzania. And we already observed the importance of sun preference, and patriarchality appears to contribute the least in terms of the strength of patriarchal structures. Turning to ideology now, the concept that I'm working with, that we're working with here, is one that's shaped on the basis of the work of Louis Althusser, Frederick Jameson, and Judith Butler. The general view of ideologies as a set of conscious or unconscious socially constructed beliefs that are held by the individual. They're generated and reproduced through the individual's voluntary as well as involuntary social interactions. And these interactions take place through formal and informal structures. And that's the ideology is what allows the individual or the subject to constitute themselves. And Althusser calls this notion interpellation. Patriarchal ideology, we can see it as a particular manifestation of the general notion of ideology, and we can think of them as a set of beliefs that pertains to relations between genders and gender roles. So, as one would recognize from the very concept itself, because it's a set of conscious and unconscious beliefs, it's hard to quantify and develop metrics for the strength of ideology. But this shouldn't take away from the fact that a significant effort has been made by feminist economists as well as others, feminist social scientists, to get a handle on this issue. I have some of the references cited here at the bottom of this slide. Basically, the approach is to say that, look, we have surveys that measures attitudes. So we assume that the responses by individuals to these survey questions proxy for their ideology. So now we should recognize that by its very nature, ideology can influence the survey participant and to respond in a particular way to a particular question. And an important consideration here is also that the characteristics of the interviewer can shape the responses. The gender, the ethnicity, the religion of the interviewer can affect the respondents' responses to attitudes questions. So one way to get around is to use responses to questions in a variety of domains as indicator variables. So you use not just violence against women, attitudes towards that, but also say equal opportunity in education, in political representation, in employment, and so on. But that in turn introduces its own danger because you may have conflicts between the different responses to different domains. For example, some women may respond yes when asked if the husband has the right to beat his wife. And they may also respond yes when asked women should have equal rights as men. So that would suggest, again, some contradiction. So the approach that's been taken in the literature is to develop metrics to measure the strength of patriarchal ideology via composite indices or statistical models. So we're going to take the latter approach of statistical modeling. Specifically, we are going to consider a latent variable model where we take the questions and the responses to the individuals to the questions in the survey, and we assume that those responses represent or are a function of a latent variable that expresses the strength of patriarchal ideology. So we estimate that using a stochastic model, and we can discuss about the details of the modeling if people are interested in the Q&A session. So the idea is to estimate the model at the individual level and then estimate the region level ideology variable by averaging over the individuals in each region. Okay, so let me just give a brief overview of the indicators that we have available for the different countries. So the rows of this table are showing the domains. So we have education, and then for education, for example, we show what are the questions, the summary form of the question that are asked in the different countries. So if you look at the first entry for education, you can see in Ghana and in South Africa, we have attitudes about whether university education is more important for a boy than a girl. We have nothing for Mali and Tanzania. And we have, for Ethiopia, we have a question that kind of looks at the same question in the sense of attitude towards education for girls compared to boys. So if the funding is scarce, do we have schooling for boys or girls, right? So Similarly, we have questions about employment. Again, some questions are lacking in some countries. And for asset ownership, we have questions only for Mali and Tanzania. And to quickly go over the others, we have questions about political leadership and rights, questions about attitude towards marriage. We have questions about how household responsibility should be shared or not shared between men and women. We also have questions about sexual and reproductive freedom. And finally, we also have questions about violence against women. So just an overview in terms of the data and the source of data and the properties of the data. Basically, we are using attitude surveys for these respective countries from either the Afrobarometer surveys or the World Values Survey. And we have some of the data. We required some imputation for missing values. And again, the details are there in the slide. Just to summarize the information, we see that all countries have indicators for political leadership and rights and violence against women. Ghana and South Africa have indicators for all the domains except asset ownership. So there are 7 domains there. Ethiopia does the poorest in terms of the data. They have only 3 domains covered in among the domains. I'll just conclude by looking quickly at the correlation between the ranks in the strength of ideology versus the ranks in the structure in terms of the strength of. So again, rank 1 here indicates the highest strength of patriarchy. So if you look at Ghana, for example, Upper East and Upper West rank pretty high in terms of are actually the highest in terms of strength of patriarchal structures, but they rank actually the lowest in terms of ideology. So those are kind of outliers, but generally speaking, you can see like a rough positive correlation. In Ghana, you can also see the same thing to some extent in South Africa. And the picture is somewhat similar in Ethiopia, again, with the exception of Somali. So again, this probably relates to what we were talking about earlier regarding the difficulties of measuring the strength of ideology, or it could be other factors related to the problems in the index itself. This is, like I said, this is a preliminary results, and this requires more investigation. So with Tanzania, we found the most scattered picture regarding relationship between structure and ideology, and we're looking into it more carefully. Finally, just to conclude, what we find is that regional variations in the strength of patriarchal structures and ideology are considerable. This has implications for women's decision-making power and the regional variation. The other finding is that the generational domination is as equally important as male domination in determining the strength of patriarchal structures. There is also a positive association between the strength of structures and strength of ideology, though the relationship is complex. And our future research is going to look into how factors related to agency can mediate the relationship between structure and ideology. So it need not be in the direction that we would expect. And also, we're going to take a closer look at the proxies of patriarchal ideologies. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. Stop here.
Thank you.
So can I just take over? I think you said yes, Tom. All right, so.
I did say yes.
But I'm not able to share my screen yet.
Oh, it's because you left and returned, I think. Hang on.
Thank you. So if everything goes well, you should be able to see my slides now. Please let me know if there's any problem.
Okay.
Thank you. All right. So first of all, as my other colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. As what you're going to see today, or what I'm going to try to present today, is really more the accepted point of view, which is mine, in the sense of what can we do in terms of exploiting information and how we should be careful about doing it. So to some extent, this doesn't necessarily contradict what Ajay just presented. It's just a cautionary tale of what might happen when you do this for other information. So it might not apply only for the work we're doing here, but it might be something that people should consider outside of this particular research area. So just to start, in economics and in social science, we are often interested in constructing indices that help us measure concepts that are otherwise difficult to identify. Just to name a few, Ajay was mentioning this idea of trying to capture the patriarchal ideologies. You might want to capture something about preferences, left or right from political views, etc., etc. So there are a lot of factors that people might not be so keen to provide a direct answer. However, we try to use other types of instruments or questions that might allow us to capture that kind of concept or idea indirectly. So this may happen because of the problem is that sometimes when we're trying to do that, we might have some difficulties identifying this concept. This may happen because there is an inner complexity of the topic. Sometimes some topics are very difficult to just identify. As I mentioned before, things like attitudes or preferences might be more difficult even for the person who's being interviewed to actually tell you what are his views. But might be easier to get through some by a battery of questions that might try to discern what exactly are a particular person's preferences. Sometimes it may not be so hard to, well, it might be hard to capture because it's a very complex topic. Like, for example, wealth, it's very difficult and that's the reason why many surveys do not really capture wealth itself. However, they end up constructing something that is as close to wealth as possible. So in all these kind of cases, we often rely with proxy variables or instruments that will help us indirectly to identify these particular measures that we are interested in, even though we cannot capture them directly in the survey. So in general, when you do that, you're going to rely on some sort of composite index approach. And there are a lot of varieties that are available in the literature. Some of them are more commonly used. For example, principal component analysis is the main method that people go when they want to construct wealth indices. You also have factor analysis, which is empirically similar, even though conceptually has a completely different approach from principal component analysis. You also have factors or methods that are a little bit more complex in your mind in terms of item response theory, structural equation analysis, or latent variable analysis. Perhaps the main advantage of these other three methods is that it allows you to control not only to capture that latent factor that you're interested in, but also if you have problems like missing data, it would allow you to overcome them by using all the information that you have available, imputing the information that you do not have information on. So people that were not able to answer, or they just were not asked to, for example. Just in general, for people who are more familiar with these, lately, some of these methodologies are called as part of the unsupervised machine learning methods, because we don't really try to create things ourselves, but we let all the structure, the inner structure of the data to tell us what could be happening within the survey, within the information that we are trying to uncover. It can also be known as these data reduction methods. That's one of the main, perhaps the main reason why PCA is known, as a way to summarize all the information based on the strength of the covariances across variables, while others focus really more on identifying the latent parameters. So what is causing the different answers that people are providing, if there are any unobserved parameter that might be driving them to answer in that way. So they all have different views on how exactly the information is being collected and what is being captured. But I would argue that most of them really fall into a construction of an index that has this kind of form. So what do I mean with here? So anytime that you want to create an index, what you're really trying to do, and as you, for example, already mentioned, is you're trying to capture a sort of weighted average for all the variables or factors that you're trying to, or instruments that you're trying to use to capture a particular factor of interest. So when you think about wealth, we include here whether or not they have certain specific assets, the characteristics of the house, etc. And we are free to decide how to provide certain weights to each one of these factors. These Fs are usually just a monotonic transformation because we believe that there is a relatively stable relationship between that particular instrument and the variable that we are trying to talk about. And these weights, they are simply given to provide perhaps more importance to certain factors, reducing the importance of others. Normally, and this is the main point I'm trying to make, is that these weights can be defined in two ways. One is exogenously, usually driven by an expert opinion or by general consensus, or you prefer by what the literature says about a particular topic. You can define this weight exogenously. However, there are going to be situations where you're not really comfortable with just using something that was created in a different framework, and you prefer to use something that will be relying more on these endogenous weights. So what would be the optimal weights that will exploit all the information of these extra variables to create the index that you're interested in? So how are these weights defined? Again, exogenous weight is usually an expert opinion. You want the extreme case is when you consider only one variable of interest. So you're technically saying only one variable has a weight of 1, the rest has a weight of 0, etc. Or you have these endogenous weights, where instead what you're trying to do is assign higher weight to variables that have a higher intercorrelation. Because the idea is that if two variables, instruments that you think are measuring that an observed factor are highly correlated, then you should give them more weight. However, variables that are uncorrelated with each other, they are probably not going to be related to that concept, that idea of the latent variable that you're trying to analyze. So you will try to put more weight to the higher correlated among other variables, and really put a weight of almost 0 when variables seem to be uncorrelated to everything else that you're trying to use as controls. So what's the advantage of this strategy of these endogenous correlations or endogenous weights? Is that you're exploiting all the possible intercorrelations that would otherwise be unobserved to the researcher. So you think about a large battery of questions. It's going to be quite difficult for the researcher to decide what should be the right weight to give to each one of those. However, if one relies on these kind of methodologies, we can just let the data, as they say, talk on its own and provide us what should be the weight and what are the right correlations that we otherwise would be ignoring. So how exactly it works then? So the idea is that we have this unique latent variable, which I'm calling here the L star, that is going to create, or guide a person to respond in a particular way in the sense of the variable that I'm actually controlling, or the instrument that I'm using. I'm also going to assume that there is an additional error that for now we're going to make the strong assumption that is uncorrelated component to everything else. If the only component then that is driving all these factors, all the answers that people are giving to the battery of questions we're giving, is given by L star, then it makes sense that all the covariances should be used to define these endogenous weights. In other words, these weights, what we are really trying to do is try to define the best kind of weights that will minimize the difference between the constructed index and that latent variable that is unobserved. So based on this, at least on my understanding on the material, is that if there is a single latent component, it's only one factor that explains everything, then there will be a strong consistency with the constructed index, regardless of which method we're going to use to identify the index. And what I mean with consistency is that they should all tell us exactly the same story. So this is something that I can show you here. So for this example, what I did is just grab some of the simulated data that is available for constructing response theorem, and I just use all those answers to create index using different methods: principal component, factor analysis, MCA, multi-correspondent analysis, some structural equations, response theory, and just a simple. Because all these variables were created by simulated data, we know that they all are being driven by a single latent variable that we are trying to capture. And as a result, we see that what we get is basically that regardless of the methodology that we are using, they are all providing very similar results in terms of the index. There is a little bit of a cloud of points that you would like not to see. But again, in all these cases, the correlation between the indexes that are being created is quite strong. So this is to me an indication that either regardless of which methodology you're using, you're obtaining a consistent measure of that latent factor that's explaining the answers that people are giving in this simulated data. So why is this a problem? Well, in most analysis, the assumptions of a single factor that drives the answers of individuals might not be true. And in fact, it might be the case that when people answer positively or relatively to a particular question, the instrument that we're using, it might be caused not by a single factor, but a set of factors. So you might say that, for example, that why people are answering on whether they prefer to send their children at their boys to school versus choose by a skill, they are being driven both by tradition, some tradition that is uncorrelated to patriarchal views. It could be driven by patriarchal views. It could be driven by some pressure that they felt at that time when they're being interviewed, etc. So there are going to be multiple unobserved factors that are explaining why they are answering in a particular way. And each one, of course, is going to have its own weight for the construction of this answer that I've given us. So in this case, the weights based on cross-variable correlations are not going to capture a single latent variable, but in fact are capturing an average of an already average set of variables or latent variables that are behind the answers. So theoretically, the weights will identify a composite latent factor, which we do not know, or a priori at least, what exactly that component or that composite latent factor is trying to indicate, or is trying to actually capture, or if that is going to be related to what we were starting to analyze, if it's related to that topic of interest that we were interested in to start with. And in some cases, it might be that those unobserved factors that we are not considering might be completely unrelated to each other, and as a result might give us some information in the sense of nothing seems to be consistent when we relate the index that is being constructed to the topic that we started with and the answers that people are giving. Perhaps something that is quite important in topics like preferences and attitudes is that it might not be necessarily because of some other factors that are driven your decisions, but also some other kind of systematic factors that are affected because on how the data is collected. When you consider information that it's quite sensitive, for instance, individuals might tend to answer differently based on the framing of the question or based on who is with them at the time when they are trying to give an answer. So all these factors are going to be captured directly or indirectly when we use these type of endogenous weight models to identify the index. So what is going to be the consequence then? Even though all these methodologies are based on the same principle, they all have different directives in terms of how the weights are going to be estimated. Thus, different methodologies might provide us or might construct indices that are inconsistent to each other because they are trying to identify different kind of factor variables, since they are giving different, there are different rules on how the weights are going to be created for the construction of the index. And these weights, again, is just going to be like weighting a multitude of latent factors. So let me go ahead and give you an example of what could be, what are the possible consequences of this and how that is going to look when you actually use the data. So the example I'm going to use is just one of the ones that Ajit already presented in terms of the patriarchal views. And this is the case for Ethiopia. And the index is going to be constructed on 3 variables. Whether or not people answer that men should be the only leaders versus women's leaders are okay. Those are the 2 options that they have, and they have to choose which one they prefer, they are more in favor of in terms of their views. The other one is women have equal rights versus they should be subject to traditional laws. Again, I would like to say that there are some ambiguities of whether these 2 questions are polar opposites from the preference position, or perhaps more like perpendicular options. And the last one, who should receive priority in terms of sending people to education. And the answer are, should you send it based on gender, meaning the boys should have the preference, or should be preference based on ability and skill? So in this case, perhaps the one that is the most clear, that doesn't necessarily contrast boys versus girls, but boys versus skill, which you can argue that it's possible that they believe that the skill should be related to gender and not otherwise. But again, the point here is that these 3 questions might be driven not only by a patriarchal views factor, but some other factors that could affect your decision. So this is what I have when I do the construction of the different index across all these methodologies. Again, what you should expect is that in all those cases, you should have something like what I have over here, a high correlation between different constructed indices. However, we also observe that there is a lot of inconsistencies across some of these methodologies. And this doesn't mean that that constructing these using any of these methods is incorrect, just that we do not really know what else we are capturing, because 2 different methods are giving us different responses or different ideas of what's the underlying unobserved factor. So are there any solutions? Unfortunately not. So these are more some reflections that I have regarding what to be done. And among those is going to be that first, we need a better selection or collection of instruments, as well as better, or at least being very careful in terms of the question framing and data quality. In other words, improve a lot on the protocols that are necessary to collect this type of data. There also there is a need for instrument cross-validation. In other words, unfortunately, I believe that just starting with a new topic like this and trying to get possible results from for example, the Afrobarometer might not be the best approach to capture information like this unless it has already been cross-validated with more qualitative analysis, where people not only provide this kind of answer to the standard questions, but also that there are in-detail interviews to try to have a better idea whether or not what's the position of an individual, and that way to select these kind of questions that should be asked for the rest of the population. It might also be important to consider not endogenous weights because of the sensitivity that they might have to the data, but to start with some exogenous weights consistent to works that have been previously done. So this is to some extent related to the idea of the cross-validation in point number 2. Finally, when there is no consensus, we probably could use this strategy, even though it's a sort of data mining strategy of trying to estimate these indices using different methodologies, just to make sure that either there is a consensus across all of them and you should be more willing to proceed, or instead, if it provides you more than one index, at least you're using this as a robustness check to verify whether or not you're truly capturing a particular latent factor, or is that there are some other problems that you might be capturing with the procedure or analysis that you're trying to do. Unfortunately, again, these endogenous weights, or on the positive side, these endogenous weights are going to be useful to start with, but it's important to verify the results and align them to expectations for common sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernando. So for the last presentation, we'll have me presenting. So. Okay. And where is mine? Okay. So we can all see that? Yeah. I can't see anybody, so. Okay, well, I'll just forge ahead and assume people can see it. So most of the work I'm going to present here was done by Louisa. She's been working on the DHS data for Ghana with Bina Doro, our country partner in Ghana from the University of Ghana. I got from her the breakdown of different questions from the DHS by region, by ethnicity, and by educational achievement. So now you'll remember that Ghana has the highest variability in the patriarchy indices that Ajit shared earlier. So we'll see if that pattern continues across other things. Okay. So I'm just going to briefly talk about the data in question and then move on to looking at some things. So we're using the Demographic and Health Survey for 2008, which asks women at least 7 questions related to decision making that we're using anyway. Who has final say on how many children to have? Who usually makes decisions about healthcare for yourself? Who usually decides about making large household purchases? Who decides about making purchases for daily needs? Who decides about making visits to family or relatives? Who decides about how to spend money that your husband earns and how to spend money that you earn? And how we're going to break this down is looking at the percentage of respondents who said that they alone make the decision, and then the percentage that say that they make the decision along with someone else in the household. And each of these is asked of women from varying subsets, appropriate as it may be. So women who aren't earning any money, for example, aren't asked about who decides about their earnings, right? So, okay. So I want to go ahead and go through by region. I made some nice maps here. I want to start by pointing out this left panel is going to be the same on each of these slides coming up. And this is the time poverty rate for married women, which is the subset that are asked various questions. This scale is kind of inverted from the other things because for example, for the percentage of respondents saying that the decision over the number of children is theirs alone goes from very low to high, kind of darker purple to yellow is the highest. And then for time poverty rates, the yellow is the lowest. So low time poverty, high decision-making power. See how, just wanted to make that, the color scales are arranged in that way on purpose. I wanted to avoid any confusion to start with. Anyway, the thing that you start noticing is that there isn't a lot of correspondence between kind of the lowest and highest percentages across questions, for example, for the number of children, right? So the region. And I'll back up one step here. We're using the 10 region map of Ghana because that's what the data is from. Ghana has reorganized the regions into 16 regions, but all of the survey data that we're using for this project predates that reorganization. So these are the old regions. Anyway, you'll notice that the Upper West region has the highest percentage of women reporting that they alone make the decision about how many children to have. And that's 29%. And then the lowest is the Central region at 11.8%, and the Western region at 11.6%. Right. But when you go to the share of respondents reporting that they make the decision with someone else, and of course the residual is they don't have any say in the decision, right? The lowest is Brongahafo, which was not the lowest before. It was kind of the second highest in terms of making the decision alone. And then Ashanti is the highest, right? Whereas Ashanti was fairly low. Only 16% of respondents reported in Ashanti that they alone made the decision. So, so there you have it. Now, there is then kind of broadly comparing that to time poverty rates. First, notice that the range is from 45 to 55 percentage points. So the time poverty rate for married women is between 45 and 55% in all of these states, regions. So, you know, the variability in that measure is not that high, but the kind of ranking which the color scale gives you doesn't really correspond. So, and that general pattern is going to be carried through to the rest of these measures. So that's for making decisions about the number of children. In terms of making decisions over the respondent's own healthcare, we have this picture here. The Western region has the highest rate of making the decision alone, but the Upper East has the highest rate for making the decision with the self and others. And again, you see the Brongahafo is kind of flipping. For joint decisions, Ashanti has the highest, right? And the Upper West has the lowest. Rates of sole decision making on this are generally higher than for the number of children, by the way, right? So the highest in terms of the number of making the decision about the number of children alone is 29%, but own healthcare is generally higher, 36% in the Upper West region. Talking about moving on to purchases, large purchases, you can see again, there's no consistent pattern here. You see again, Brongahafo is the lowest in terms of making decisions alone about large purchases, but you know, it's kind of in the middle when we talk about making the decision with self and others. The highest is Volta for making decisions alone, but Ashanti for making decisions with self and others, although Volta is kind of the runner-up in that regard. Looking at daily purchases, right, the rates are generally higher. You can see here that the rate for daily purchases goes from 27.7 in the northern region, making decisions alone, to 73.2% in the Upper East. The decisions about family visits are a little more look a little more consistent. At least now we have one picture in which the Upper East has the best results for all three. The family visits, the Upper East 42% and 94.5% are the rates for for making decisions alone or alone and others. Moving on to earnings, this is own earnings, right? Yes. Yeah. So what we see for own earnings is, there's a lot of kind of decision-making power for women in terms of own earnings, right? So the self and others ranges from 85 to 95% of respondents. So most women have a lot of, at least some say about what's done with their own earnings, right? In Volta and Upper West, for example, the large majority of women have the only say in terms of what's done with their own earnings, right? But in terms of husbands' earnings, it's not surprisingly smaller, that women don't have sole control over what happens to their husband's earnings, right? But the rate of decisions made by self and others ranges quite widely for this question, right? And Western and Ashanti regions have the highest in this case, and Upper East has the lowest percentage of women who have some say. In the Upper East, it's 19.7% of women report having some say in decision. Okay, so so there's little correspondence, at least with these kind of broad brushstrokes between not just between decisions, the decision-making power, sole decision-making power, and joint decision-making power, but also with time poverty rates, and also across questions, right? So if you look at the different questions, the rankings change in terms of the rates of women having control over those decisions. So so that's the regional picture. So I'm going to move on and talk about ethnicity and then educational achievement, and then wrap up so we can have some time for questions and answers. In terms of ethnicity, there's a good deal of variability. These are the numbers for decisions made alone or with others. There is some general pattern in terms of where women have more decision-making power across the questions than others. And among the Akan and Ewe people, the percentages tend to be higher across questions and lower among the Gruma and Mande. But there are exceptions to this, right? So, frequently it kind of flips when you talk about self versus self and others, right? So, for example, when we look at large purchases, right, among the Mande, who generally have lower percentages than other ethnic groups, the highest rate of decision with others among all the ethnic groups there. And then for the Gruma, for example, this in terms of making decisions about family visits, that's second highest incidence of making decisions jointly. Finally, looking at husbands' earnings, it's again fairly low rates of women reporting that they only they make the decisions, but it's where was I? The highest are among the Akan and Ewe, lowest is the Gruma, which is the kind of pattern, and the Grusi are the highest here. So so that's ethnicity. There's a lot of variability, and there's no clear clear pattern across all the different questions. So let's look at education, which is slightly more regular in terms of similar results across different questions. And the general pattern is that higher levels of education translates to more decision-making authority. But there are exceptions. For example, the number of children. Right? For the number of children, those with higher than secondary education have the lowest rate of reporting they alone make decisions. Whereas among the joint, it's 95%, right? So that may not be that strange, right? That might be intuitive, actually. Then for questions of purchases, right, it tends to increase with education level, both self and others, right, for daily or large purchases. Family visits, again, it's the reporting of self-only decision-making power is lower for the higher educated groups, but higher for the joint. And finally, in terms of earnings, there's a jump between no formal education and primary education, and then a slight decline. But the secondary and higher educated women are more likely to report self-only control over husband's earnings than no formal education. But if you look at the joint decisions, it's higher education, higher rates, right? And then again, own earnings, self alone declines with education, but self and others increases. So there is some correlation between higher education and more sharing of decision making between husband and wife, right? In some categories: own earnings, number of children, family visits, right? But everything else with increases with education. Okay. So just to quickly wrap up, it doesn't seem that we can combine these into a useful single measure of decision-making power, right? So I think the direction forward is going to be analyses either by individual questions or by groups, right? Maybe grouping things like purchases together might be more fruitful. The greatest correspondence between decision-making questions and rates of time poverty for married women by region was for the number of children when the decision was made with others, right? So that was the most similar in terms of the kind of correlation between time poverty and decision-making power about number of children. And in terms of ethnicity, Akan and Ewe individuals have the highest rates of power, decision-making power for the most part, and Gruma was the lowest. And decision-making power is correlated mostly with education. So the next thing to do is gathering more data on regional level indices of patriarchal structures, ideologies, and outcomes, things like participation in political decision-making bodies, etc. And then looking at the interrelationships, right? So the kind of digging in and putting it all together and seeing what we get. So that is that presentation. So now I will ask Nkechi Owell to step in. And do you need to share your screen?
No, I'm just going to sort of share some of my comments, just speak to them.
That's great.
That's it. Okay, so thank you very much for all your presentations. I found them to be very interesting. I've been asked to comment specifically on the presentations made by Thomas and then Louisa, so that's what I'm going to focus my feedback on. So I'll start off with comments from Louisa's presentation and then continue with some feedback on Thomas's presentation, and then I will have just a couple of general comments for both speakers. Now, when I read the abstract for the first presentation, I did have a few questions about how women's control over time was to be measured. So from reading, it suggested that it would be measured by, a more equal division of housework between women and then their male partners, and also measured by women spending less time in these domestic engagements. Now, either of these definitions, I thought, might be a little bit narrow, because women's time, as we know, involves not just domestic work, but also market and then community engagements. So less time spent in domestic work would not necessarily mean that a woman has the power to influence her time allocation in other areas of her life. But then even if the term control over her time is to be restricted to time in domestic work, I wondered whether it would be important then to consider the intensity or the nature of the domestic work. So would a woman have the power to opt out of certain kinds of particularly undesirable or strenuous domestic work? So I think it will be important to clarify how this term, control over a woman's time, is to be measured or proxied. It may not be accurate to equate this term with simply time spent in domestic activities. Now in the abstract, the authors also alluded to a bidirectional relationship between women's decision-making power and then their time use. Now in the presentation, it was clearer that the authors were focusing more on the effects of women empowerment on time use. But then it begs the question how endogeneity in the relationship would be corrected for. So for example, less time spent on domestic work could increase women's empowerment and bargaining power through increased earnings from market work, for example. This is why interventions like better access to piped water and other labor-saving domestic technologies are so critical in many parts of the developing world. In the reading of the abstract, there also seemed to be an inherent assumption that women may be willing to shrug off traditional gender ideologies in favor of having more control over their time. Now, particularly in the African context, which this study focuses on, sometimes a woman's sense of womanhood and or motherhood can be tied to her domestic responsibilities, to her childcare responsibilities. Cultural expectations can be quite strong, and in some cases, women themselves may rail against these equal divisions of household labor because it's tied, the amount of work that she may do could be tied to her respect and reputation within the household and the larger community. So this is a discussion that I think it would be important to have. And then finally, I agree with the researchers in the concluding sentences of the abstract that women's control over their time is shaped by relationships with people within the household, husbands, mothers-in-law, but I think that this also can be much broader and extends to the larger community. And Louisa talked about this a little when she presented the slides on the gender ideology theory. So there can be people within the community elders, religious members, social networks, among others, that could exert less obvious but quite substantial influences on the amount of time that women spend on domestic and or childcare responsibilities. And it's important to recognize this, especially since the goal of the paper is to influence policy. I'm going to switch over now and present some comments on the second paper presented by Thomas Masterson. I think that to be useful, the use of particular indicators as a proxy for women empowerment should be guided by the country context. When I read the abstract, I wasn't entirely sure that, for example, decisions on smaller purchases for daily needs would be symbolic of women's empowerment in all country contexts. In places like India and Nigeria, for example, where women's movements are more seriously limited, this might be a way to measure empowerment levels. Also, ensuring that daily needs like food are present in the household may not necessarily mean that a woman is empowered, but rather she is self-preserving, because a lack of these provisions could be met with violence from her male partner. So I think that the use of some of these indicators can be employed, but should depend on the country context. And I think that there could also be an argument made for not analyzing individual indicators due to concerns of data mining, but rather generating an index for a variety of country relevant indicators, an issue that I was happy to see was raised in an earlier presentation. And now I want to turn my attention to some of the results that Thomas shared as well. The finding that the Upper West had the largest share of respondents reporting that women alone decided the number of children to have, I found to be quite interesting. But then again, what does it mean when women in an already high fertility area like the Upper West region of Ghana report that they alone are making decisions on fertility? Is this truly higher empowerment and decision-making ability? It may be likely that men need not impose any influence because average numbers by themselves are high enough. It may also be that women are aware of what is expected of them by society and simply toe the line. So rather, it would be important to try to understand if there are any repercussions if women decide to deviate from existing fertility trends and have fewer or no children at all. The finding that in the Volta region, women have the most say over their husbands' earnings, and that our women have the greatest decision-making power in certain respects, I also found to be surprising, given the general, given the cultural setting and the general perception that our men tend to wield significant patriarchal authority over their households. I also found it surprising that decisions on own fertility and use of own earnings declines with women's increasing education. I wondered what the story could be behind that. Are these women compensating for their higher education levels by allowing male partners to take the lead on some of these decisions? Well, I was a little bit I'm thrown by that result as well. Just to conclude, I kept on thinking to myself, what does it mean when we say that women alone take these decisions, or that they make the decisions by themselves? I mean, how can we be sure that this is devoid of social or cultural pressures? And really, would an African woman, where your study is situated, admit to playing a larger role in decision-making within the household if it goes against traditional or cultural expectations of the man being the head of the household? So for example, in the Nigerian Demographic and Health Survey, while we see only about 5% of women say that they take decisions on large household purchases, when their male partners were asked, this percentage was closer to 18%. So to what extent does this study consider differential response to these decision-making or empowerment questions by women and by men? I think that since the project tackles questions of measurement of empowerment, and especially in the African context, some of these issues relating to culture and patriarchy should be brought up. Now, just a few general comments on both papers. Now, both papers highlighted the difficulties of measuring women's decision-making powers within the African context. Both papers touched on the potential role that cultural norms and expectations play in decision-making within the household, or the distribution of responsibilities within the household. Although it's not as easy to measure, the impact of patriarchy and culture are themes that cannot and should not be ignored in these studies. Now, I also noticed that neither paper acknowledged the significant role that children can play in women's empowerment and or decision-making status. I mean, on the one hand, the presence of children could raise a woman's status within her household, particularly in highly pro-natalist settings where higher status accompanies higher fertility. But on the other hand, childcare responsibilities could seriously impair women's mobility. We have other scenarios where the presence of children may increase a woman's acceptance of violence, according to the marital dependence IPV theories, but may also improve domestic work burdens through the provision of domestic labor by older children. So depending on how it is measured, therefore, a woman's empowerment situation may change depending on whether she has children or not and how many, particularly in the African setting. And now in both papers, I found myself asking again, exactly what is women's decision-making power within the household and community? Is it her ability to take sole decisions on issues, or her ability to bring a male partner to the table so that these decisions are taken jointly? Could it also be the option to deliberately opt out of decision-making processes within the household without any repercussions? And I was happy to see that in the presentation by Louisa, she also raised some of these questions. Now, I didn't get the sense that primary data would be collected, so I think it's important to provide at least some nuanced discussions of these issues and also be clear on the limitations of the use of existing data where present. Now, both of these papers touched on critical issues of women empowerment and difficulties with the measurement. And they also stimulated a lot of critical thinking and debates, even at this very early stage. I look forward to reading more on the findings from this project, and I would like to sincerely commend the researchers on such a thought-provoking research agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nkechi. And then now Beatrice Mkenda from Tanzania will. Beatrice.
Unmute. Yes, thank you so much.
Do you need to present anything? Or
yes, I do. I was trying to unmute myself, and the cursor was running all over the place. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Thomas, and thank you for the opportunity to comment on this paper. Two papers, but mainly the first one. I want to commend the authors for their research and insightful findings, and for the nice presentation. Really, the insights that research provides on how strong patriarchy is and where they rank it and how it varies regionally in the different countries was quite interesting, and between countries also, and finding and to read about the comparisons that are made between countries. And also the focus on the patriarchal structures, which were able to be calculated using indices, from the objective ones that can be done to the ideological ones, which are quite tricky, and hence that cautionary note that we had. This study on patriarchal structures and the indices is quite good for Sub-Saharan Africa, because not much has been done, really. I've seen work on India, very rich work on India has been done, and the study findings are quite important in the sense that patriarchy is something that underlies the cultural norms that we see and are behind the gender inequalities that we see in different communities. And by understanding how they play out can, in the long run, help to meaningfully put in place policies that are going to improve gender inequality and empowerment. And hence, my comments, I've structured them into 4 sections. The first one will look at the use to which the study, which I've already hinted at, findings can be put, of course, data allowing. And the second one would touch on the composition of the patriarchal structure, specifically the son preference that the findings are brought out. The third one is this issue of the importance of generational domination in the patriarchal structure. For regarding that aspect, I actually have a question on that. And then I'll move the last one to deal with the validation of the findings, bearing in mind the cautionary note that's been given on the estimation of indices. Now, starting with the use to which the study findings can be put, with data allowing, I thought that the research is quite useful in 2 ways. The first one is that if there is a way it could be done, data allowing, that the historical perspective is looked at. It would be useful if there is data that can then allow to track how each of these indices in these different countries has changed or evolved over time as a contribution to monitoring whether gender inequality is narrowing over time, so such that this application can then help towards knowing progress that Sub-Saharan Africa is making towards gender equality. And the ranking of countries can also be done according to those that have made more progress versus the other in terms of the indices. I'm not sure the extent to which that kind of data is available. I had a chance to read something on India where this was possible because there was data before and people were able to track historically how that has evolved. The second, of course, is with regards to policy application. I think the regional variations that the study brings out across the countries are useful for providing more targeted policy interventions. The cultural norms and beliefs tend to be quite different and unique in different communities and settings. And so policy would be more guided and more targeted by knowing these differences and how, and with time to see whether they are evolving or narrowing, so that policies can help, or policy approach can be in place to help accelerate the narrowing of the gap, or if nothing has happened, to sort of make interventions on how the processes can start. The second comment relates to the composition of the patriarchal structure. The interesting finding that is seen with regard to the sub-index of son preference, where some regions in the different countries that are looked at don't show any son preference at all. Son preference does not appear. Specifically for Ethiopia, it's seen for Addis Ababa, Amhara and Tigray, Bamako for Mali, and Ghana, there's Greater Accra, Ashanti and Central, and Tanzania a lot, because there's a lot of regions there, 16 out of the 30 regions, no sub-index of son preferences is found there. I was just wondering whether one can start thinking about how that can be explained. Partly, I was wondering that maybe these regions where son preference has not been found, could it be that these regions are more urbanized? And the reason I'm thinking that way is that when you have more urbanized regions where no dominant ethnic or social norm is dominant, different cultures come together, and someone who might have moved from where son preferences comes to the city, for instance, where there's more people from different regions, they get influenced with maybe if they come from regions where son preference is not an issue, and over time that view changes. Could that be the reason behind? And of course, such answers can be found or can be more enriching if maybe case studies probably are undertaken to see exactly those regions where this son preference does not play out. The third comment relates to the importance of the generational domination here in the patriarchal structure. This is an interesting finding, but also I thought I could pose a question here with regards to the aspects that go into the sub-index. Is it possible to sort of get an indication or information that would sort of reveal what is common in African communities relating to the way elderly members of the family are regarded as ultimate decision makers on, it could be family matters, it could be assets, it could be their participation in authorities, or even the storehouses of the knowledge about the whole community. If maybe that can be, if there's data or information that can go into trying to see whether this can go into the index, maybe it can be quite revealing, because I was trying to I find it difficult to see the indices, the others that go into it, and how that then comes up as generational domination. The last one relates to the validation of the findings of the study. I think the bits that I've read regarding patriarchy indices and how they've been done in India, for instance, when an index is made, attempt was made to link that index to already existing gender equality indices to see whether there is some association, and strong association has indeed been found. But in this case, I think what the study does by including the ideology, in a way, kind of takes care of that. The way the ranking is done with the structure of ideology versus the strength of the structure provides validation needed. So given the complex association that of course are found in the regions, for some that can't really give a really clear explanation, perhaps as the study indicates at the end, that maybe adding other aspects in future, which will look at agency, will help to sort of unravel this relationship, so that when the patriarchal indices can also be matched with the strength of an ideology, the extent to which the cultural norms drive the patriarchal indices. Lastly, just a small comment on the cautionary note by Fernando. I think it's heartening that in the end, what is proposed about the solutions on how to deal with all the problems that one can face with regards to the indices, it's heartening that, you know, there's no single solution. The provided solutions allow us to simply, you know, tell us that let's handle whatever data or whatever we're trying to come up in form of an index carefully, that we can defend it and we don't run into the problems that might arise. With that, I want to thank you, the researchers, once again. It was an interesting study for me to look at, to read and learn what's being done. I also look forward to reading the full paper once it's done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Beatrice. So we're ready for questions and answers now, unless any of the my fellow panelists would like to address any of the comments or questions that were raised.
I suggest that since we have only like about under 15 minutes left, we should let the audience have the first go. If you have specific questions or comments or observations that they would like to make, and then take it from there.
Mm-hmm. Sounds good. And our country partners and advisory board members can just pipe right in if you want. You have the power. Everyone else I control. I see a hand raised somewhere.
I already noticed
Monica.
the questions in the Q&A.
Yep. I'm sorry. Damn it. Monica,
Luisa, if you just want to read out the question and then respond to it, because it may be of interest to others too.
Yeah. Monica has a question. But Lillian Leondi, who is on our board, asks if the research consider religion as one of the factors for disempowering women in terms of decision-making and time use. So, and then Monica Lambon, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, it's actually a contribution or a comment. Thank you very much for the very interesting presentations that we have heard today. I just, like Nkechi, I was quite surprised to see some of the findings, especially with Thomas's presentation on the various decision questions for the various regions. I know this is not, maybe this is something that you have only done using secondary data, but I wonder if it would be very useful to get, maybe to just do some country level qualitative data collection just to really understand what is going on behind some of these things. And I only speak for the results that Thomas already showed in Ghana's case. Like in Nkechi, it was very interesting to see that, different parts of the region were showing particular, results. And that was a bit contrary to what we are actually used to seeing in the country. Personally, I was very surprised to see that the Gwans and the Grushi, for instance, a larger proportion of the women actually said that they had a larger say in their husband's earnings. Now, these are regions in the northern region, and they have the highest levels of patriarchy based on the measures that we spoke about in this particular in the presentation. So I just thought it was very, very interesting. Another thing that was strange to me was the education bit. So I think Nkechi already alluded to this in her discussion when she said, is it possible that women might be compensating for this? We had some project that was looking at the distribution of domestic work between men and women, and we're testing various hypotheses. And we had some preliminary findings that suggested that, even though the woman is empowered, the role of culture is still very, very strong. So it's possible that the woman is educated, but she still wants to cede the decision-making when it comes to a lot of things to the husband, just so that she's able to maintain peace in her home. So these were the few things I wanted to, point out, and also to suggest that if it's possible at all, you could do some small level qualitative data collection in these various countries so you can tie the pieces together in terms of the findings that you're seeing. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha. And then Ekua, Flora, and then Mr. Kamagenge. Ekua, did you have a question? Ekua Ansashon? I'm sorry if I'm making a...
Ekua is muted. That's why.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's only a suggestion I want to make. I am suggesting that we should look, the researchers should look at the income level of women against the effects of patriarchy, of authority of the male partner in the home.
Mm-hmm.
What is the income of the male? What is the income of the woman? Because it does play a role, especially in the urban centers. I know that in the 50s, when you go to markets, you find the Ewe women there at the market, and they were very educated. I don't know what it is that made them like that. I know that it might be linked with the German influence, but the income structure that the researchers are talking about is practiced with the fisher folks. The fisher folks go for fishing, and then it's the women who turn their catch into fish. So they decide, they buy the cloth for the men, they buy the household needs and things like that. But then, even then, they are given a limit as to how much should be brought back to the husband and how much should be used. So I think in measuring these things, income levels and income patterns should be taken into consideration. Thank you.
Okay, and then Flora and Amadeus.
Thank you so much, presenters. I
I may be preempted by Monica's and Ekwa's comments, but I wanted to highlight what I was specifically thinking in terms of whether we have room as research team to look at a bit beyond, like, okay, I'm asking myself the so what question. Okay, yes, we find these high levels of patriarchies here and there, like across regions. It's higher in the south, lower in the north. So what are we going to, like, what else can we say, or can we explore with that? For instance, how much is this impacting on the livelihoods of the women? Looking at even the definition of Louisa, you mentioned about the fact that we are taking Naila Kabia's definition to look into the agency, but also resources, achievements. If we look at the two, for instance, resources, achievement, look at the livelihoods aspect. For instance, I'm talking about my country now, the way it is affected negatively with the time limitation or overburdens of time for most or many women, particularly in the poor levels of income. I think we could maybe just complement or say something on what are the like, what is the so what with this? Like, we think the higher levels of patriarchy is affecting in this way or that. And I'm saying that my two previous questions that came may be overlapping, because I know one had, for instance, suggested the issue of qualitative or case studies coming with this. I don't know if we have enough resources and if this is falling within this phase, but I thought it may be important and helpful to, in the end, say, this is causing this is leading into this is complicating this or that, as we are also linking this to policy actions. But also the other part I wanted to mention linked to this is on the policy. For instance, it's great that the analysis went as low as the regional level in the countries, because then different regions with the different context and the cultural norms and all that may have different policy actions, and good enough. For instance, in Tanzania, we do have even lower levels. There are some levels of policy decisions and formulations at local level that I know they're not maybe called policies, they're called maybe guidelines, or they have a certain political name. But if we want to intervene now, we could contextualize these findings down to the region and say, this is what we are seeing in your region, and this is what we could do. This is what is impacting, and this is what we could do, but let's discuss and see how we can together find recommendations and how we can improve the situation. So I thought it was powerful that we have put this down to the regional level, but then we have a good opportunity for some countries to contextualize and start intervening from there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Flora. Mr. Kamagenge.
Thank you so much. Firstly, I should mention that this project or this research is indeed very, very useful. And for our countries, or some of our countries, findings from this study or this research will really influence policy making in this area. I have a comment on two areas. One is from the presentation which was made by Louisa, if I'm pronouncing correctly the name. When discussing or looking at women empowerment and decision making, you mentioned one factor that is on women employed for cash. Now, my comment here is looking at countries in the region, increasingly governments and other agencies have introduced cash transfer programs. And if I could cite one in Tanzania, it's women who are mainly receiving cash. So while you are referring to women employed for cash, it could be a good idea as well to look at the impact from such a programs where women are receiving cash, whether that can also influence decision making and empowerment. Because, for instance, for the program, I think even in Ghana there is a similar program, but I'm not very sure whether it's women who are receiving cash. But for this program in Tanzania, it's a significant program which is supporting between 10 and 15% of the population. So it's really an area which could be looked at, and because increasing governments or countries are embarking on these programs. But the second point or contribution is related to the presentation by Ajit. Forgive me if I'm not correcting this name.
Okay. You're right.
This subject is really very interesting and very relevant in this region. But now my comment is on areas, particularly urban areas. You mentioned Dar es Salaam.
Right.
When it to strength of patriarchal structure, look at that Dar es Salaam. In Tanzania, we have about 120 ethnic groups.
Right.
In Dar es Salaam, you almost have the presence of all these ethnic groups.
Mm-hmm.
So now coming to really conclusive findings that in terms of strength of patriarchal structure in a place like Dar es Salaam or similar urban areas, I think we need to think more about this, particularly in the urban areas. Otherwise, I want to thank you so much. This is a very, very interesting study, and I'm grateful that I've been privileged to participate as one of the Research Advisory Council member. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And then Greg, and then I'll give the panelists a quick chance to respond, and then we'll have to end since we're at about time. But thank you, Greg. Go ahead.
Yeah, please. Thank you for allowing me a little bit more time for a question. So I'm Greg Seymour. I'm a researcher at the International Food Policy Research Institute. We've also been working a little bit on the topic of time poverty, control over time, measurement of women's empowerment. So I'm really happy to see that you guys are also working on this, and it would be great, as I said, that to talk together at some point to see, share our thoughts. So the relationship between time poverty and women's empowerment, I think, is very complex, and that's something we've wrestled with a lot in our work. The stance we've tended to take is that time poverty by itself can't tell us that much about women's empowerment. And to some extent, I think we also think the reverse is true. The problem is, as we kind of see it, is that some women can exercise or may exercise their agency in some way that increases their workload. So they opt in, they choose to work longer hours. While there are other women who are working longer hours, have higher time poverty out of necessity. And so I'm curious, what your thoughts are on this issue and how it's kind of factored into your work. So thank you.
Okay, so do we want to go in order? You want to go first, Louisa?
Yes, I can go first. Thank you so much. There's so many interesting comments here, and I feel that, I don't know, I feel that we have, at least on my perspective, that I have accomplished something with what I've done so far, which was exactly to bring about this discussion and be very honest about the limits of what can be said and what cannot be said here, and where we need to do contributions and where we can go forward. So I feel that mainly the problem, and Greg just mentioned this at the very end here, and I'm glad for that, is that what we observe in terms of decision making is, that might tell us something about agency, but agency is a potential. It's a potential of making decisions, which does not necessarily convert into a decision that is made. And it's very complex to measure this thing. And then we also don't know exactly how that impacts the control over time. As many people have mentioned already, more responsibilities might mean more empowerment. There is endogeneity here, there is reverse causality. We have many of these problems when it comes. And what I wanted to do is exactly bring about the theoretical perspectives of how those things relate. But I think what we did on the first part of the project on the last 2 years before that has made us believe that what explains the time use in that region has to do with bargaining power and gender ideology. It's not time availability. And that's why I decided to explore this further and try to put another piece of evidence here. So this is why we're attempting to bring about all these questions, which is a very limited way of looking into agency or looking into empowerment, but that's what we have. So I absolutely agree with anyone that mentioned collecting primary data or doing more qualitative research on this. And I hope that at the very least, this research can put into light the fact that this is extremely needed as a research agenda.
Ajit, you want to?
Okay, well, thank you. Sorry, Tom.
I said you want to briefly give a couple comments?
Yeah. I'll be very brief. I just want to thank everyone for the close attention that they gave to our presentations, especially our discussions. Given that, you had just the slides to go by and the abstracts to go by and not completed papers, I really, really appreciate, and I want to thank you on behalf of all the team members, the effort that you put in to trying to digest this information conveyed in a rather cryptic way and through slides and bullet points, and really give us very, very useful comments, which we will definitely take into consideration in going forward. And I hope that you do not feel burdened if we approach you for clarification regarding some of the points you raised, or indeed ask for your suggestions regarding how we address some of the specific issues that you did raise. Thanks are also due to several other commentators, and the question of gathering qualitative evidence was mentioned at least in 2 or 3 occasions, and I think that is crucially important. And unfortunately, given the current time frame of the study and of course the budget that we have for the study, we cannot undertake anything like this, but we will definitely think about that as part of future work that we would do in the region. And I just want to make also a brief comment about that the current work that we are doing for these 5 countries in the region is actually, it builds on the earlier work that we have done on Ghana, Tanzania, as well as on Ethiopia and South Africa. So that research effort that's been underway has really tried to look at the determinants of time and income poverty together. So we have, like one of the commentators did raise the issue regarding income differences and how that figures into this whole question. And of course, that's something that we're exploring in the next year of our research, but it's also something that we have looked at in depth. That is how time and income poverty are related to one another, income or consumption poverty. So I'll stop there and I'll pass it on to Fernando for comments and observations that he may have.
Thank you, Ajit. Well, first of all, again, thank you very much for all the comments. My position again, which I think is something that we all have commented, is ideally you would like to have some kind of qualitative study that you can validate information. Nevertheless, I believe that the position we're trying to make, which is even though we're trying to use this idea of endogenous weights just to go ahead and try to create an index, we're also trying to validate it to the extent that the literature that we're consulting suggests very similar results to what we are finding. And I think that in general, that's one of the things that we need to establish. Now, going forward, it might be perhaps more important to set up a methodology design where we can keep constructing the indices the same way so they can be comparable across time, since that's another of the main, perhaps the most important factors that you need when you create this kind of index is create a relatively stable methodology that you can use forward to make comparisons and progress, etc. Which I think would be the only additional comment to what I mentioned before, or what has been mentioned already, which is create indices based on all your knowledge, be able to defend it, make sure that it's consistent with what you have from the theory, and try to make it consistent so you can keep using it towards the future to see progress, etc. Tom?
Okay, thank you. So I just want, since we're already over time, I do want to thank all of the panelists and Nkechi and Beatrice for their wonderful comments and the interesting questions and comments we got from our participants today. Thank you all for coming. I did drop a short just kind of feedback form in the chat. If you could do that on your way out, that would be great. This is the kind of midway point of this project, and so we're just kind of giving our update on progress to date. And the feedback we've gotten so far today has been really, really helpful, and will help us move forward in a productive way towards making policy recommendations that can be actually useful in terms of policy making. So thank you, everybody. And please join us again tomorrow at 9 o'clock, where we'll have some we'll have some presentations from some of our country partners. And then in the second session, we'll have a policy roundtable discussing challenges to achieving women's economic empowerment. So please join us again. And until then, I'll see you all later. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Merci, Adoma.